Why would a black woman simply standing next to a gleaming SUV on the streets of Savannah become the target of two racist police officers who assaulted her in broad daylight under the indifferent gaze of so many passers-by? The false assumptions they carried about her race led them to an ending they could never have foreseen. The woman they looked down on was in fact a major, carrying within her a force powerful enough to shake an entire system. Would justice truly rise when the truth was finally laid bare before the whole nation? Where are you watching this video from? Leave a comment below and stay with us until the end to help spread the journey of justice. Savannah, Georgia, a city draped in cobblestone streets and moss-laden trees, still wears a gentle facade, but beneath it, the fractures of a racist history have never fully healed. And this morning, on one of its historic corners, that truth quietly pushed its way to the surface. A black Mercedes-Benz GEL SUV sat parked by the curb, its polished surface gleaming under the soft sun. Beside it stood Naomi Brooks, a black woman in her early 30s, neatly but simply dressed, arms loosely wrapped around her handbag. Her posture was upright, her gaze calm, yet her very presence, so quiet, so self-assured, rattled the ingrained prejudices of the street. The sight of a black woman standing next to a luxury SUV, not in uniform, not accompanied by anyone, stirred dormant biases in the minds of those around her. A middle-aged couple emerged from the bakery across the street. The man muttered just loud enough for Naomi to hear, "Trouble already this early?" The woman clutched her purse tighter, gliding past Naomi with a look that flickered between suspicion and discomfort. Across the way, a young man pushing a stroller shook his head and grumbled under his breath, probably looking for something to steal. Naomi heard every word. None were said to her directly, yet each one pricked at her skin like small, cold needles. She knew exactly how she was seen. Too noticeable to be harmless, too different to belong. The city had likely never truly escaped the ghosts of its past. This was a place where the grand houses along Victory Drive had been built on the sweat and blood of enslaved people, where the shadows of Jim Crow still hid within every ordinance, every unspoken glance about who belonged and who did not. Here, even in the 21st century, the color of your skin could still determine your safety or your peril. A few storefronts away, a small bakery called George's Finest was open, filling the corner with the scent of butter and hot waffles. Her husband, Marcus, was inside, standing in line for coffee and toast, telling Naomi to wait by the car for no more than 5 minutes. But in Savannah, 5 minutes could stretch into a lifetime if your skin marked you as someone who didn't belong. A group of patrol officers moved toward Naomi, their footsteps heavy, loud against the quiet air like the tapping of a ruler on a tense classroom desk. From the way they adjusted their belts, the way their hands tightened around their radios, from the way Daniels, the one in front, scanned Naomi as if she were some unfamiliar object to be inspected, everything made clear that, to them, the anomaly wasn't the car or Naomi's behavior. It was her skin. That was the threat they had come to neutralize. Naomi stood her ground. She did not flinch, nor did she provoke. She understood the law. She knew her rights, but she also knew that in moments like this, truth and justice were not always shields thick enough to protect you. A soft breeze stirred the hem of her shirt, and with it, something fragile cracked within the false peace of the Savannah morning. Officer Daniels moved in first, his heavy steps casting a large shadow across the sidewalk where Naomi stood. Blake followed closely behind, his hand hovering near his belt, just half a step from his taser. 2 men, 2 faded blue uniforms, 2 eyes filled with barely concealed contempt, and a shared objective, to turn the woman before them into a problem that needed handling. Naomi remained motionless, her arms resting naturally at her sides, her gaze steady, neither defiant nor submissive. She knew that even a slight movement, a flicker of the wrong emotion, could become the excuse they were waiting for. Daniels barked, his thick South Georgia accent cutting through the morning air loud enough for every passerby to hear. "Whose car is this? Government issue? You borrow it or steal it from someone?" Blake sneered, glancing at the SUV and then running his eyes over Naomi from head to toe like he was sizing up a cheap counterfeit. "Probably just following someone, waiting to snatch something, huh?" Naomi swallowed the burn rising in her throat. She had heard words like these before, in airports, in supermarkets, even in the neighborhood she called home. But this time, she was no longer the little girl who had to blink back tears behind her mother's back. She was Major Naomi Brooks, and she owed no one her bowed head. She answered calmly, her voice steady and cold as steel. Under the United States Constitution, the Fourth Amendment protects citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures. "Do you have a lawful reason to approach and demand to search me?" A sharp pause. Daniels narrowed his eyes, his expression shifting from mockery to barely contained rage. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by a black woman right here in the heart of Savannah. Blake smirked, dripping with disdain. "Oh, we've got a lawyer here. A mouthy suspect talking about civil rights? Definitely hiding something." Daniels stepped closer, now less than half a foot from Naomi, his breath reeking of stale coffee and cigarettes. He snarled each word, dragging them across the space between them like rusted barbed wire. "You are resisting lawful enforcement. You know that, right?" Naomi stood her ground. Her voice, sharp and deliberate, cut through the thickening tension. "State the legal basis for this encounter. If none exists, I am asking you to withdraw. I do not consent to a search, nor to being detained without reasonable cause." A small crowd had begun to gather. A woman pulled out her phone, pretending to text but angling her camera steadily toward the confrontation. The air grew heavier, as if just before a thunderstorm. Daniels caught sight of the recording phones, and realized that if he didn't act quickly, the chance to crush this out-of-place woman would slip away. He turned abruptly, shouting loud enough for all to hear, "You are resisting an officer. Place your hands on the car, now." Blake circled behind Naomi, his hand already clutching a pair of handcuffs. Naomi could feel her heartbeat hammering in her chest, not from fear, but from the white-hot anger tightening every muscle in her body. But she knew this was not the time to fight with fists. Resolve would be a sharper weapon than any blow. In a voice low but unmistakably clear, she said, "I am not resisting. I am exercising my rights as a citizen." Daniels lunged forward, grabbing Naomi roughly by the shoulder and shoving her against the SUV door. "Shut up and do what you're told," he hissed, as if Naomi's calm itself were an affront to his fragile sense of authority. Around them, more bystanders began recording openly. An old man standing at the corner shook his head, his eyes a mixture of anger and helplessness. But no one stepped forward to intervene. Naomi inhaled deeply, closing her eyes for one brief moment. She knew that this morning she might be handcuffed, thrown to the ground, even dragged across the sidewalk, and to men like these, it could all be justified under two words: reasonable suspicion. Naomi could feel the cold surface of the SUV door pressing into her back, the hard metal biting into her spine, the chill seeping not just from the weather, but from the way it reminded her. In the eyes of these men, she was nothing more than an object to be controlled. Daniels clenched his jaw, his eyes bulging with rage as he saw Naomi standing tall, refusing to bow, refusing to kneel. In that moment, he no longer saw a suspect. He saw a black woman who dared not submit. Naomi tightened her grip on her bag strap, her breathing ragged with anger, yet her voice stayed steady, unwavering. "I demand you immediately cease this unlawful use of force. I do not consent to a search. I do not consent to being detained. You are violating my Fourth Amendment rights." Each word fell like a hammer striking the thick, heavy air. A group of passers-by had now fully stopped. A young white man raised his phone, capturing the image of Naomi standing upright before two towering officers. Daniels growled, his voice choked with blind fury, "Who the hell do you think you are giving me orders?" Then, without warning, he swung his hand and slapped Naomi across the face. The sound cracked through the air like a whip, her head snapping to the side under the force, her hair falling loose over one eye. But she stayed standing, her body swaying only slightly, her gaze burning with a cold, fierce pain. Before Naomi could regain her balance, Blake rushed in, slamming her body against the SUV. The impact rattling the car with a sharp metallic clang that echoed down the street. As Naomi staggered, Daniels leaned close to her ear, his words dripping like venom. "You think dressing up is enough to act like you belong? Someone like you doesn't belong in this neighborhood, doesn't belong with that car, and sure as hell doesn't belong in this country." Blake shoved her again, muttering under his breath, "Crawled out of some gutter, no doubt. Parasite." Naomi clenched her jaw tighter, the taste of blood spreading across her tongue from the corner of her lip. Yet she uttered no plea, raised no hand to shield herself, shed no tears, nothing that these men so clearly expected. She stood tall, drawing from every fiber of her being to hold on to her dignity, just as generations before her had stood, had fallen, and had risen again on this very soil. Naomi's eyes scanned the crowd, the fearful, confused, hesitant faces. A middle-aged man in a baseball cap aimed his phone steadily at them, his hands shaking but determined not to lower the camera. A young woman stood weeping, whispering, "Oh God, this is happening." Daniels gripped Naomi's wrist, squeezing as if trying to crush the bones beneath his fingers. Blake pulled out the handcuffs, the cold steel glinting under the morning sun. But then, something in the air shifted, not because Naomi begged for mercy, but because her silent defiance had begun to spread. A small child, perched on his father's shoulders, called out loudly amid the tense crowd, "Daddy, why is the policeman hurting that lady?" The innocent question hit like a grenade, shattering the heavy silence. Daniels faltered, his face flushing red. Blake looked around, realizing the crowd was no longer sneaking glances. They were witnessing. They were watching. But wounded pride is a dangerous thing. Daniels snarled again, no longer bothering to mask his contempt. "We are the law here. And there's no place for trash like you." Naomi, her cheek bruised, her shoulders aching from the blows, lifted her head high. In a voice low but resonant, she replied, "The law wasn't made to serve men like you. The law was made to protect people like me, and today, everyone here will be a witness." In that moment, Naomi was no longer standing alone against two abusers of power. She had turned the gaze of the crowd into a light that would illuminate the truth, forcing Savannah, and soon all of America, to confront the wounds they had spent so long trying to hide. The sting of Daniel's slap still burned hot across Naomi's cheek. Her shoulders ached from Blake's violent shoves, but none of that pain compared to the deeper wound, the humiliation of having her worth, her family's sacrifices trampled on the very soil they had bled to defend. Naomi tightened her trembling hand into a fist, her nails digging deep into her palm as if anchoring her rage to keep it from erupting. Part of her wanted to scream, to strike back, to tear apart the thin veil of order these two men pretended to represent. But a stronger part, the part forged through years of military service, the lessons seared into her by her father, her grandfather, and all those who came before her, whispered steadily into her ear, "No, you're stronger than this." Naomi lifted her head, her gaze, cold and steady, cut through the morning air like a freshly sharpened blade. In a voice low, hoarse, but full of power, she said, "You have just dishonored what my family shed blood to protect." The words were not merely spoken. They rang out like a solemn oath, a quiet but undeniable bell that made even a few in the crowd shiver. Daniels hesitated for half a second, a flicker of confusion flashing in his eyes. Blake's hands, still trying to force the cuffs on her, faltered for a breath. But then the deep, ugly instincts of power reclaimed them. Daniels leaned in, his voice a hiss through clenched teeth. "Blood? Don't kid yourself." At that moment, a figure burst through the gathering crowd, his face contorted with rage. Marcus, Naomi's husband. The paper bag of coffee and toast tumbled to the sidewalk, scattering like the ruins of a once normal morning. Marcus saw Naomi's swollen cheek, saw her slammed against the SUV like worthless cargo, saw the cold, uncaring faces, and in that instant, his world exploded. Without thinking, Marcus charged toward Daniels, fists clenched, ready to defend the woman he loved with everything he had, ready to show that not every black man would stand by silently. But before Marcus could touch anyone, Naomi reached out and stopped him. Her touch was as light as a breeze, but in it was the weight of countless generations, pulling Marcus back from the edge of the storm. Naomi turned, facing him fully. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but not a single one fell. In them lived pain, fury, and a will carved from stone. "Don't, Marcus," she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear above the rising noise of the street. "That's what they want. They want us to lose control. They want a reason to justify their crimes. Don't give to them that victory." Marcus froze. Naomi's words wrapped around him like chains, binding his fury tight. He gasped for breath, his fist trembling, but slowly he stepped back, planting himself beside his wife, shoulder to shoulder, a silent wall of resistance. Naomi turned back to Daniels and Blake. Her voice, this time, didn't need to shout. Each word slammed into the charged air like nails being driven into stone. "You picked the wrong people to intimidate, and I swear you will pay dearly for this." Blake exhaled heavily, clutching his belt as if to restrain the anger still burning inside him. Daniels darted a quick look toward the crowd, now thick with raised phones and steely gazes. He knew one more wrong move and this would spiral beyond his control. A twisted, bitter smirk curled across Daniels' face. He motioned for Blake to step back, feigning some pitiful act of mercy. "Get out of here before I change my mind," Daniels snarled, his voice dripping with the smug satisfaction of someone who thought he had crushed his prey. In his mind, Naomi had been humiliated enough to remember her place, and now letting her walk away would only underline his supposed magnanimity to those foolish enough to believe it. Naomi stood still for a moment, staring straight into the hollow eyes of the two officers, reading every small cowardly calculation they couldn't hide. This wasn't mercy. It was fear dressed up as mercy, a coward's retreat, an attempt to avoid consequences they knew they deserved. She did not answer. Instead, she squeezed Marcus's hand, a silent vow the story was not over. Together, they walked toward the SUV, backs straight, heads high, leaving behind the whispers, the shameful glances, and the two men who still believed they had won. Daniels spat something hateful after them, curses laced with venom, but Naomi didn't turn back. She opened the door, guiding Marcus in first, then took her place behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, breaking the eerie silence that had fallen over the old city street. Naomi drove slowly past the men who had tried to crush her, her eyes fixed ahead, cold and unflinching as ice. The gleaming black SUV disappeared down the rows of old streets, leaving behind not just a sidewalk littered with the shattered pieces of a broken morning, but also a crowd adrift in emotions they couldn't name. No one left immediately. The older white woman, who had once hesitated, perhaps ready to intervene as Naomi was assaulted, stood frozen, clutching the straps of her purse as if grasping onto something even more fragile than faith itself. Her eyes were wet, but she said nothing, took no steps forward. That look, an aching blend of belated regret and fear of being drawn into something bigger than herself, was the perfect portrait of Savannah that morning, a city choking on its own chosen silence. On the sidewalk, whispers spread like oil across water. "This is going to be all over the news," muttered a middle-aged man in a baseball cap, his tone unsure whether to sound amused or alarmed. "She must have done something to get the cops on her like that," a young woman whispered to her friend, doubt lacing her words. "I heard people like that just like to stir up trouble with the police these days," a young man said, thumbing frantically at his phone, desperate to stay ahead of the outrage online rather than face it in reality. No one spoke Naomi's name. No one spoke of the humiliation she had just endured. They only spoke of disruption, of inconvenience, of something abnormal that had rattled their morning, treating Naomi like a strange gust of wind that had blown through their old town, stirring the dust, only to be forgotten by sundown. The crowd effect, the invisible but powerful current, moved quietly among them. Some shook their heads, tossing out lazy laments about how messy things are these days. Others crossed their arms, gazes hardened, as if Naomi's presence this morning was an unwelcome reminder that the injustice they thought had gone away was standing right in front of them, refusing to be ignored. Not everyone was indifferent. An elderly black man sat on a wooden bench, a gnarled cane resting in his hand. He said nothing, simply stared down the street where the SUV had vanished. In his eyes lived the weight of a lifetime of witnessing and surviving the wounds that Savannah liked to pretend had long since healed. A few people drifted away, muttering lines like, "Don't want to get involved, not my business. Even filming won't change anything." In that moment, Savannah stripped itself bare, a city beautiful on the surface but paralyzed by fear of deeper change, a community divided, not just by race but by the thin line between personal safety and moral duty. Naomi had walked away, but she had left behind a question no one could escape. When injustice happens before your eyes, will you stand up or turn away? Those who remained on the sidewalk had to answer it for themselves, even if only in silence. And it was in that silence that Savannah, and perhaps all of America, revealed a harsh truth. Sometimes oppressors don't need to strike again. Sometimes the silence of witnesses is enough for injustice to thrive. A soft breeze swept down the street, scattering bits of paper across the ground. And in that moment, for those sharp enough to notice, it became clear. It wasn't just Naomi carrying the wounds of that morning. The whole city, every cobblestone, every moss-draped tree, was cracking in silence. The black SUV had disappeared behind the moss-draped trees, but the crowd on the sidewalk had yet to fully disperse. They stood still, their eyes lingering on the space where Naomi had vanished, as if waiting for something else to happen to sweep away the heavy weight in their chests. Daniels glanced around, his lips pressed into a thin line. He cleared his throat, tugged his belt a little tighter, and stepped forward a few paces, raising his hand in a half-command, half-concerned gesture. "Everything's been handled. Please move along and avoid obstructing traffic." Blake nodded beside him, face set in stern, responsible lines, posing as if they had just completed a heavy burden in the name of community safety. His eyes, wary and edged with irritation, flicked over the raised camera phone still pointed at them. The crowd began to drift away in silence, no voices raised in protest. Heads bowed, phones lowered, as if once again The habit of submitting to authority had crushed the instinct that should have stood for what was right. Daniels and Blake turned back toward their patrol car, their steps slow and deliberate, shoulders squared, aching, backs straight, performing the presence of authority across Savannah's historic streets. The car door creaked open, and only once they were inside the cramped, glass-sealed cabin did their true selves reveal themselves. Daniels slumped into the seat, letting out a dry laugh and slapping the steering wheel. "You see that? One move and the whole damn lot shut right up." Blake chuckled along, the sound brittle and reeking of triumph. "Thought she'd be begging and crying," he said, grinning. "But nope. Spouted a few lines about the Constitution and then tucked its tail and ran." Daniels drawled mockingly, listening to her preach about the Fourth Amendment, civil rights. "You'd think she's never seen a pair of cuffs before." He barked out a loud laugh, the sound hammering the foul rot that hung heavy inside the patrol car. Blake leaned back, arms folded, nodding sagely. "Maybe they'll file some paperwork, get lost in the pile like all the others. A week, 2 at most, and nobody will even remember the name Naomi Brooks." Daniels sneered, a flicker of deep, ingrained contempt in his eyes. "They think a fancy car and a nice outfit change anything? Around here, we are the law. Stand as tall as you want, one slap, and you fold like a damn straw house." Blake snorted, pulling out a pack of gum from the glove compartment, chewing noisily as if trying to scrub some lingering itch from his throat. "Was kind of fun, though," he added, lifting an eyebrow toward Daniels. "It's been a while since I got to handle someone that mouthy." Daniels let out a gravelly laugh, turning his gaze out the window. Savannah's streets rolled by in their slow, sun-drenched calm, golden light spilling over the worn cobblestones, and in his mind, the world kept turning just as it always had, with men in blue acting as judge, jury, and executioner, all rolled into one. To Daniels, Naomi was already nothing more than a fading shadow, a small, irrelevant scratch that would soon be erased, a stray, black breeze that had stirred the street for a moment, only to be swept away by the long, unbroken silence this society had perfected over generations. He spat onto the floor of the car and muttered with open disdain, "They think they're gonna change the world with a cheap-ass phone camera? Pathetic." Blake chuckled darkly, nodding. "Let 'em play their justice games. I'll still be patrolling every day, still saluting the flag, still getting pats on the back at those fancy award ceremonies." The two burst into harsh, ugly laughter, each bark of sound slicing deeper into the raw truth they were too blind or too arrogant to see. Neither of them realized that every word, every smirk, every bitter laugh they shared inside that patrol car was another heavy stone laid into the grave they were digging for themselves. Outside, Savannah rolled on, serene as ever, but beneath that calm surface, a wave was forming, and this time it would not slip quietly away. That afternoon, Savannah's sunlight faded to a pale gold, spilling over the stone steps of the city police department like tattered silver carpets. Inside the front desk area, the air still buzzed with the simmering smugness left over from the morning, when Daniels and Blake had silently added another victory to their invisible ledger. A young officer behind the reception desk yawned, lazily drawing meaningless circles on the scratched wood surface. His world, and that of the entire police station, spun on, steady in the belief that every inconvenience would eventually blow over like dust under their boots, until the door swung open. No one heard footsteps approaching from afar. No one sensed the quiet storm gathering beneath the old streets, until the heavy glass doors burst open and Naomi Brooks stepped in. She wasn't wearing civilian clothes. She wasn't clutching a handbag. She wasn't bowing her head. Naomi walked straight in, clad in the full dress uniform of a United States Army military police major, her polished silver buttons gleaming, the single star on her epaulettes catching the cold overhead light. The uniform clung to her form like a declaration written without words. The truth had entered the room, and no one could pretend otherwise. Flanking her were two federal internal affairs agents, striding forward in silence, their eyes sharp as scalpels slicing through the stale air. Their boots struck the worn tile with a heavy thud, thud, each step counting down the final moments of the station's unchallenged comfort. The front desk room froze. The young officer at the desk shot up, knocking over a cup of hot coffee that splattered across the floor. In the next breath, chairs scraped, files flipped open, radios crackled. Chaos rippled through the room like a sudden squall. Daniels and Blake were lounging in the officer's break room, sipping iced water, laughing about how that girl's probably crying in some hole by now. But as the sharp, measured footsteps grew louder, Daniels looked up and felt his heart seize in his chest. Naomi Brooke, the woman he thought he had taught a lesson, was standing in the center of the station, not as a helpless civilian, but as a high-ranking military police officer towering like a living monument. Daniels swallowed hard. His hand slicked with sweat. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. Blake staggered to his feet, his face draining to a sickly white. Naomi did not look at them immediately. She moved slowly to the front desk, removed her service cap with a crisp motion, folded it neatly and placed it firmly on the countertop. The air seemed to vanish from the room. No one spoke. No one dared to ask why she was there. Because everyone, from the newest recruit to the hardened veterans, understood with cold clarity. Naomi's presence in full uniform accompanied by federal agents was not to beg, not to plead. It was to reclaim every shred of dignity that had been trampled. Naomi turned then. Her gaze swept over Daniels and Blake, not screaming, not snarling, only a cold, still look, the way stone statues have stared down passers-by for centuries, passing silent judgment. One of the internal affairs agents stepped forward, flashing a badge at the front desk. A senior officer fumbled to receive it, his voice quivering. What's this about?" The agent's voice answered, low and ringing. "There are allegations of assault and serious civil rights violations involving two of your officers. We need to see the commanding officer immediately." A dead silence fell across the room. Daniels instinctively stepped back, sweat pouring down his temple, while Blake stammered like a man waking from a nightmare. Naomi didn't need to say a word. Her calm, unyielding presence was the indictment. And in that moment, Daniels and Blake realized, far too late, that the name Naomi Brooks, the one they thought would be forgotten, had become a shadow they could never outrun, not just today, but for the rest of their lives. The main conference room of the Savannah City Police Department was bathed in the sickly white glow of fluorescent lights, exposing without mercy every crack in the walls and every worn patch on the faded wooden table. But no amount of light could dispel the heavy air pressing down on the room, thick enough to strangle every breath. Naomi Brooks sat at the head of the table, her military police major's uniform fitting her like armor. The silver star on her epaulette glinted coldly under the lights, a silent witness to the journey that had brought her here, not by force of arms, but by the strength of dignity and truth. Beside her, two federal internal affairs agents sorted documents in silence, their calm demeanor only deepening the oppressive weight hanging over the room. Across from them, Daniels and Blake sat hunched. The cocky arrogance of the morning now dissolved into restless unease, their figures shrinking into their chairs like men haunted by unseen specters. Around them, the department's captains, seasoned officers, and even the chief himself filled the room, each wearing varying shades of discomfort and dread. The arrival of federal investigators had forced this entire institution to confront what it had long pretended not to see. The truth. One of the agents stepped forward, placing a small laptop on the table. No introductions, no explanations. Naomi simply gave a slight nod, and with that, the room fell into a chilling silence as if the very air braced itself for the blow about to fall. The screen lit up, displaying the footage from that morning, Naomi standing tall beside her black SUV in the pale dawn light, a seemingly mundane moment until Daniels and Blake stormed into frame, their faces twisted with aggression and contempt. No questions, no requests for ID, just Daniels' hand swinging brutally, and the crack of his slap echoed through the conference room like a hammer striking the old stone floor beneath them. People flinched. The sound, sharp and unforgiving, shattered the fake peace the room had once clung to. The footage continued. Blake shoving Naomi against the SUV, the metal reverberating with a sharp clang, then the ugly, venomous words spilling from Daniel's mouth, staining the air like black ink seeping into rotten cloth. When the video ended, no one moved. No murmuring, no shuffling papers, only a suffocating silence, thick as a velvet shroud, drapes over the room. Naomi lifted her head, her eyes scanning every face, trying to look away. There was no gloating, no triumphant smirk, only a calm, solemn expression, and deep within her gaze, an abyssal sadness for a system she had once trusted, for people who had chosen to bow their heads instead of standing upright. Daniels sat frozen, his hands clenched so tightly that the knuckles gleamed white. He felt cold sweat trailing down his spine, each drop a silent testament to a fear he could no longer hide. Blake seemed on the verge of collapse, his eyes darting like a cornered animal, all his morning bravado dissolved into pitiful, naked fear. Naomi rose, her voice steady, not loud, but each word sliced through the stifling air like a cold, sharp blade. I did not come here today to punish anyone. I came to remind you all that honor is not something you wear like a uniform. It is built through actions, through choices, and through every moment you face wrongdoing and refuse to turn away. She locked eyes with Daniels and Blake, her gaze burning not with the fire of revenge, but with the searing light of painful understanding. The silence grew even thicker, as if the very walls and windows were leaning in to listen and bow their heads. They touched me, but not just with their hands. They touched the dream of justice that generations before me bled to protect, and today you have all seen that wound. No one answered. Daniel's head sank, his broad shoulders trembling in a pitiful shudder. Blake squeezed his uniform in his fists, his hands shaken uncontrollably. Naomi nodded slightly to the internal affairs agents. A heavy folder was handed to the chief, thick with the weight of an invisible indictment. No threats, no further declarations. Everything that needed to be said was already crystal clear. Naomi replaced her service cap, straightened her uniform, and turned to leave without a backward glance. She knew that from the moment that slap had echoed through the halls of the police station, a door had closed behind them all. No denial, no excuses. She had left behind a truth that no one could ignore, and a wound Savannah would take a long, long time to find the courage to face. When Naomi Brooks walked out of the Savannah Police Department, she left behind not just a case to be dealt with, but the first stirrings of a silent storm. The conference room door had barely closed before the federal internal affairs agents set to work, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the sharp precision of veteran surgeons. At first, the investigation focused solely on the morning's incident, the assault and civil rights violations committed by Daniels and Blake against a uniformed military officer lawfully going about her business. But as they brushed away the dust from old files, they uncovered something deeper, something festering that no one in that room, or perhaps in the entire city, was ready to face. Complaints, thought to have been long buried in forgotten cabinets, surfaced one after another, file after file. Names unknown to the media, but hauntingly familiar to the poorer streets of South Savannah. Malik Carter, 17, his arm broken during a routine stop on suspicion of drug possession, though nothing was ever found. Rosa White, 58, hospitalized with bruises after failing to cooperate when asking for information at the station. Jamal Green, 26, suffering 2 broken ribs while being temporarily detained for investigation. Every victim shared one thing: they were people of color. They had been pushed into the shadows by hastily written reports, vague internal memos, and a quiet lack of evidence, decisions that no one challenged. Daniels and Blake, names listed under officers with excellent service records, were, in reality, spreading an unchecked infection. Worse still, they had not acted alone. Internal Affairs soon traced the pattern of a systematic cover-up: edited files, missing camera footage, witness statements disappearing, internal complaints misfiled or pending processing. An invisible web of silence cloaked the department, like thick moss on ancient walls, solid on the outside, rotted through within. Those who had nodded along during Naomi's speech now revealed their true faces: pale, stammering, defensive. A captain who once wrote a glowing promotion letter for Daniels now claimed he didn't know all the details but trusted him as a longtime colleague. A civilian clerk responsible for complaint records admitted, trembling, that she had been directed by superiors to prioritize internal handling. The rot was not confined to 2 violent men. It had spread into every link of the chain, every memo, every nod of willful ignorance. Savannah, a city so proud of its historic streets and horse-drawn tours, was being forced to look into the mirror and see what had been growing unchecked in its depths. In the departments, whispers traveled faster than the official orders. Some hastily burned their notes, others scrambled to submit sudden leave requests, some frantically called their attorneys, their voices shaking with dread. And still others clung to the desperate hope that if they stayed quiet enough, hid deep enough, the storm might somehow pass them by. But this time, the storm spared no one. The list of suppressed complaints grew longer and longer, stacking high on the Internal Affairs conference table like a giant mural pieced together from the painful memories of the people who had once been rendered invisible. Naomi, from a distance, monitored the investigation's progress through each updated report. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction at seeing once proud faces pale and quiver, only a heavy sadness, an emptiness like someone watching their beloved home burn to the ground, even knowing the rot had set in long ago. Savannah could no longer pretend that its moss-covered stones hadn't been soaked with blood and tears. The system that Daniels and Blake once believed would shield them now showed cracks spiderwebbing outward under the unforgiving light. The disease that had spread unseen for years had been dragged into the daylight, raw and undeniable. And, for the first time in a long time, the whispers that filled Savannah were not rumors about an isolated incident. They had become questions, whispers demanding justice, the kind of justice that Naomi Brooks, with a single slap, a single bruise, and a uniform shimmering with silver stars, had dared to awaken. Less than 12 hours after Naomi Brooks stepped out of the heavy doors of the Savannah Police Department, the storm of justice truly took shape. And this time, it no longer crept through whispered conversations or complaints shoved into forgotten drawers. It burst forth like a furious tempest sweeping across the nation. The video of Naomi being slapped and shoved against her SUV alongside Daniel's cold, degrading words was uploaded online just hours after the internal hearing. The first to post it was the young man who had pretended to text that morning. At first, he had trembled while pressing upload, afraid of the consequences a young white man in a southern town like Savannah might face for standing on the side of truth. But when he saw Naomi respond, not with fists or hatred, but by choosing the long road of justice through the law, he knew this was the right thing to do. Within hours, the video spread like wildfire. Hashtags erupted, the most prominent among them a rallying cry. Hat justice for black soldiers. People were not only outraged that a black woman had been attacked, they were furious that she was a military officer, a symbol of loyalty and sacrifice, ideals America once prided itself on. Major news outlets picked up the story. CNN, NBC, and CBS played the short clip on a loop, analyzing each frame, every sound, every word hurled from the mouths of uniformed officers. Commentators debated civil rights, the legitimacy of police authority, and the dark underbelly of local policing systems long whispered about but never so vividly exposed. Savannah, the quiet tourist town with mossy oak trees and horse-drawn carriages, suddenly became the epicenter of the nation's attention. Its postcard-perfect images gave way to footage of stunned faces, chants for justice, banners stretched across historic avenues. Protests ignited, first scattered around City Hall, then rapidly expanding. People carried signs reading, "Her blood wears our uniform," and "A badge is not a license to assault." Veterans, long silent, began to raise their voices too, standing amid the crowds, holding up old photos of themselves in uniform as declarations that they would not accept this insult. Yet, as with every storm of justice that has ever broken over America, a countercurrent of resistance rose alongside. A small, conservative group gathered, waving "Support our police" banners, chanting slogans in support of Daniels and Blake despite the glare and evidence. They branded Naomi a troublemaker, a threat to the city's peace, spinning tired lies that she had provoked the officers, an old refrain still easily consumed in a society that had never fully shed its deeply rooted biases. Naomi watched it all from afar. She saw her face on TV screens, her name splashed across digital headlines, spoken with admiration, anger, gratitude, even hatred. But she did not post, did not comment, did not issue statements. She understood that true justice is not won through viral shares, angry status updates, or trending hashtags. Justice must be fought for in quiet rooms where evidence is laid bare, where laws still hold meaning, or where they will be forced to reclaim their meaning. The young man who filmed the video, once terrified of retaliation, stepped forward, revealing his identity and pledging to testify if needed. In a brief national interview, he choked up and said, "I've stayed silent long enough. If she can stand against injustice, I can do my part too." His words, simple and sincere, spread across social media like a second wildfire, rekindling courage long buried under layers of fear. No one could deny anymore. The case of Naomi Brooks was no longer a local matter. It had become a wake-up call for an entire nation, a stark reminder that skin color could still dictate how a person was treated, regardless of the stripes on their shoulders or the oath they had signed with their lives. Savannah, beneath the downpour of banners and chants, was no longer just a quaint city of dreamy tours. It had become a mirror, exposing the true face of modern America, brilliant in courage but torn by wounds never truly healed. And Naomi, with the bruise still faint on her cheek, with her eyes as steady as on the first day, stood quietly in the center of the storm, not as a victim, but as one who had lit a fire that, this time, no silence could extinguish. The media storm did not subside. It spread with terrifying speed, as if the long smoldering fire beneath America's surface had finally found a wind strong enough to ignite it into a blazing inferno. Naomi Brooks's name was no longer confined to Savannah's local headlines. It appeared atop major newspaper articles, echoed in the opening lines of national news broadcasts, and plastered across banners in public squares from Atlanta to Chicago. But more than that, her story struck a nerve in places that had long grown numb to injustice. Civil rights organizations, black veterans groups, and the small but unyielding battalions of civil liberties lawyers who had been fighting in near silence for decades. From tiny, cramped offices, tucked behind old city streets, to packed halls brimming with people, names like the NAACP, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the ACLU spoke out together. Not because Naomi was an exception, but because she was undeniable proof of a disease everyone knew existed, but had long chosen to ignore: the disease of badges wielded as unchecked power. In conferences and forums, people began to speak more about a concept once familiar only to lawyers: qualified immunity. It had been designed originally to shield public servants from frivolous lawsuits, but over time it had become a colossal shield protecting those who had forgotten their oath of honor. To sue an officer, a citizen not only had to prove their rights were violated, but had to show that a court had already ruled against almost the same misconduct. If not, the case would be dismissed no matter how blatant the abuse. That twisted logic had long sheltered countless others like Daniels and Blake from accountability. But now, in the face of the video showing Naomi slammed against her SUV, the sting of a slap laid bare, and the chilling words uttered in broad daylight, that shield began to crumble. Activists demanded not just the prosecution of Daniels and Blake, they demanded the dismantling of the very protection that had allowed men like them to flourish. A movement to abolish qualified immunity surged forward, stronger than any wave before. Online petitions gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures within a single day. Civil rights attorneys, long weary from courtroom defeats, found new fire in the eyes of their clients. And it wasn't just the activists. Black veterans, those who had once worn the American uniform with pride, who had fought in distant lands believing naively that they would return home to be honored as heroes, stepped out from the shadows. They raised banners bearing a simple but searing declaration: we did not fight to be humiliated on our soil. Marches erupted, not only in Savannah but in dozens of cities. From the cracked avenues of Detroit to the glittering plazas of San Francisco, voices thundered in unison: no more shields for injustice. The media descended, interviewing families who had lost sons, daughters, parents to police violence, only to be turned away by courts under the armor of qualified immunity. They spoke of sleepless nights, of photo albums stained with tears, of dreams stolen without a single official apology. Even members of Congress could no longer turn a blind eye. Bills that had languished in bureaucratic limbo, like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, were dragged back into debate, now backed by unprecedented momentum. The people were not just demanding the punishment of a few rotten individuals. They were demanding the transformation of the entire field. Of course, resistance persisted. Police unions, conservative politicians, right-wing media outlets all warned that dismantling qualified immunity would cripple law enforcement and leave communities unsafe. But this time, fear could no longer so easily drown out the call for justice, because this time it was not abstract theory or dry legal papers confronting the public. It was the undeniable face of Naomi Brooks, a Black American soldier, humiliated in broad daylight by men who claimed to uphold the law while forgetting its most basic moral foundations. This time, it wasn't just outrage. This time, it was a collective fight for dignity. And this time, the wave was too massive, too furious to be turned back by the same old excuses. Savannah, once proud of its cobblestone streets and hidden gardens under sprawling oak canopies, now swayed like a small boat caught in a violent storm. Gone were the leisurely horse-drawn carriages ferrying tourists. Gone were the outdoor concerts filled with laughter. Instead, a tide of anger and suspicion surged from the heart of the city, crashing against the very center of power, where for so long decisions had been quietly handed down behind closed doors. Under unbearable pressure from national media, human rights organizations, and the citizens of Savannah who now filled the streets daily, the city's mayor was forced to appear before the public in an emergency press conference. His face, once familiar for its easy smiles and hollow slogans, now appeared pale and stiff under the relentless glare of dozens of camera lenses. With a trembling, reluctant voice, he announced that the city would launch an independent investigation into misconduct at the Savannah Police Department, specifically addressing the accusations against Daniels and Blake. But even as the words left his lips, a barrage of sharp questions erupted from reporters, flying like arrows. Mr. Mayor, why did it take a citizen's video going viral nationwide before you acted? Were internal complaints against Daniels and Blake deliberately buried to protect the city's image? Are you aware that over the past 5 years, Savannah has led the state in the fastest dismissal rate of police misconduct complaints? Each question landed like a punch to the face of those who had long hidden behind a curtain of organized silence. The city's once touted moderate leadership now had its mask torn off on live television. Worse still, just hours after the press conference, a massive leak of documents ignited the fury to a new level. A thick dossier was delivered to major news outlets, filled with complaint letters once tucked away in locked basement filing cabinets. Every page bore raw testimony of negligence, unchecked power, and willful blindness toward the cries for help from the city's most vulnerable. One letter was from a black mother describing how her 16-year-old son had been dragged from his car and beaten by Daniels and Blake for staring too hard. Another came from a black Iraq War veteran, detailing how he was shoved and insulted while simply asking why he had been pulled over. Each story ended the same: lost complaints, insufficient evidence, unreliable witnesses, and now, in front of all America, these truths could no longer be hidden. The Savannah police chief, who had sat comfortably atop his throne for years by closing his eyes, was also forced into the public eye. Unlike the mayor's strained composure, the chief's flushed face and faltering voice only deepened the disaster. He stammered about an overloaded system, about not every complaint being credible, about the department's best efforts to protect the community. But outside the press room, where hundreds rallied, holding signs reading, "We won't be silent anymore," those excuses rang hollow, the dying echoes of a crumbling world. In the crowd, a middle-aged black man in a battered military jacket stepped up to the citizen microphone. His voice was rough, but thundered like a funeral bell. "You did not just betray Naomi Brooks. You betrayed a whole generation who bled and sweated, believing their sacrifice would be met with justice. You turned Savannah into a graveyard for hope. No one inside dared to meet his gaze. The anger did not stay confined to city halls. It spread into neighborhoods, churches, schools, and coffee shops on quiet corners. People began telling their own stories of being mistreated, humiliated, and forced into silence because they knew the system would never side with them. Small, isolated memories piled atop one another, creating a monstrous tapestry that no one could pretend not to see anymore. And when the foundation of trust finally cracks, no apology, no press conference can ever truly mend it. As the entire city simmered with unrest, media swarmed every narrow street, and protests spilled from moss-draped squares into the quietest neighborhoods. All eyes turned to Naomi Brooks, as if she had inadvertently become the soul of a movement she never intended to ignite. Major news outlets bombarded her with emails, texts, calls, all pleading for the same thing: an exclusive interview, a statement, a powerful image for the front page. Human rights organizations clamored for her to become their figurehead. Offers glittered, opportunities sprawled before her, but Naomi quietly turned them all down. She chose silence. Marcus watched her, pride and worry flickering in his eyes. He didn't press her. He simply sat beside her in the living room, his hand gently holding hers as a silent reminder that he was there, no matter how wildly the world outside collapsed. "Are you sure?" Marcus asked, his voice low and careful, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace they had managed to shelter inside their small home. Naomi nodded softly. She turned to him, her eyes clear and unwavering, like a deep lake reflecting a stormy sky. "I'm not here to be a star, Marcus. Justice isn't won through cheers or TV ratings. It has to be enforced, step by step, line by line of the law, no matter how slow, no matter how painful." Marcus squeezed her hand tighter. He understood, more than anyone, the war raging within her. There were times when he himself had longed to scream, to fight back for every scrap of dignity stolen through the years. But he knew, too, that Naomi, the woman he loved, was strong in a different way, through silent endurance, through her refusal to let anger define her. Outside the window, the flashing red and yellow lights of police cruisers and protesters' banners intermingled like flickering embers. But inside their home, Naomi sat straight back, untouched by the chaos. She thought of the black women who had come before her, those who could not speak, could not stand tall, could not choose intellect over bloodshed. She thought of her grandmother, who once had to walk 3 extra blocks to avoid a whites-only diner in the 60s. She thought of her mother, who had taught her, through gritted teeth, that you have to work twice as hard just to be seen as half as good. In Naomi's mind, these memories were not burdens. They were torches. And she knew it was her responsibility to keep the flame burning, not through explosive fury, but through the steady light of perseverance. Marcus rested his head lightly against her shoulder, sighing. "This world doesn't deserve you," he whispered, half in sorrow, half in pride. Naomi smiled faintly, a smile both sad and warm. "I'm not doing it because it deserves me, Marcus. I'm doing it so maybe, one day it will." Outside, the chants continued, slogans and speeches rolling like waves down Savannah's ancient streets. Yet, amid all that noise, it was Naomi, the woman without a shouted slogan or a raised fist, who had become the most powerful symbol. A candid photo of her leaving City Hall, her back straight, her hand clutching her military cap, her gaze unflinching into the camera's lens, circulated across social media. It needed no elaborate caption, just one simple line: "Justice doesn't need rage. It needs to be resolved." On television panels, political commentators and social activists debated Naomi's choice. Some praised her as a symbol of inner strength. Others criticized her for being too passive in a moment that demanded bold action. But Naomi didn't care. She didn't need the analysis. She knew the path she had chosen, even if winding, even if lonely, was the only one that could truly lead to justice. That night, before bed, Naomi stood silently by the window. The breeze rustled the trees outside, carrying the distant voices of those still marching, still fighting. She closed her eyes, listening to her heartbeat, to the echoes of the past, and to the future she was helping to shape. There was no hatred inside her, only a simple, unshakable faith that once lit, justice would never die, as long as there were people willing to hold the flame. Tomorrow, she will take another step forward, silent, steady steps, just like those who had walked before her. And America, if it had any conscience left, would one day have to learn how to follow. After countless days of waiting, the fateful trial had finally arrived. That morning, Savannah's sky wore a thick, ashen cloak, heavy and silent, mirroring the charged air enveloping the Chatham County Courthouse. Long before sunrise, hundreds had gathered on the stone steps, clutching banners, their faces lit with a mix of hope and apprehension. Naomi Brooks' black SUV pulled around to the rear entrance, away from the crowds. She stepped out, clad in her crisp military police major's uniform, her hair neatly pinned back, her face calm and still, like a lake before a storm. Inside the city's largest courtroom, preparations had been made the night before. Every seat in the public gallery was filled. At the front, large boards displayed photographs of Daniels and Blake, once swaggering in their police uniforms, eyes gleaming with unchecked arrogance, now mounted beside the defendant's box under a blood-red headline, "The Betrayers of Public Trust." No one in the room could ignore the stark contrast. On one side stood Naomi, her silver stars gleaming in the muted morning light. On the other, two men who had once held unchecked power now sat crumpled in wrinkled suits, their eyes averted, hands clenched around the last tatters of their crumbling pride. On the judge's bench, a dark wooden gavel rested, waiting to strike the first blow of a trial the entire nation was holding its breath to witness. It was said that never before in Savannah's history had a case of police assault been tried so openly, so publicly broadcast, and never had the public's trust dangled so precariously on every testimony and sidelong glance. Marcus sat in the front row, his eyes locked on Naomi. He knew she sought no fame, only the truth, and this time, truth had a real chance to speak, no longer muffled by doctored reports or backroom phone calls. The entire courtroom rose as the judge entered, an elderly man with silver hair and eyes as cold as the Great Lakes in winter. He did not smile, he did not nod, he stood tall as a reminder that justice, real justice, was not a favor granted but a duty that could not be escaped. The trial opened with the prosecutor's rapid-fire charges: assault, abuse of authority, violation of civil rights, breach of public trust. Each accusation struck like a hammer against the rotten shield the system had once provided for Daniels and Blake. In the gallery, murmurs stirred. A young black woman wearing a t-shirt emblazoned with Naomi's image leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, "No one has the right to wear a badge and turn it into a weapon against the people they swore to protect." An elderly veteran, frail and hunched beneath a faded service cap, nodded grimly. They thought a gun and a badge made them the law. Today, they'll learn what it feels like to stand beneath it. Naomi was called to the witness stand. The courtroom collectively held its breath as she rose, each step steady like a soldier on parade. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore her oath, her voice clear and unwavering. As Naomi began recounting that morning, the room sank into a strange, reverent silence. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She simply told the truth, in words so plain, yet so heavy they seemed to anchor the very air. She described Daniel's eyes as he raised his hand to slap her, the silence of bystanders as she was shoved against her car, the feeling of being assaulted not just by hands, but by an entire system that had abandoned its oath. Daniels and Blake sat hunched, trembling, a pen slipping from one of their fingers, clattering to the floor, ignored. They were no longer officers of towering authority. They were two small, broken men facing a mirror of truth they could no longer evade. Across televisions and live streams, the public drank in Naomi's words like water in a desert scorched by injustice. Social media erupted. This isn't just a trial for Naomi. This is a trial for all of us. Naomi isn't just facing two cops. She's facing an entire system. Today, justice is learning how to speak human again. And in the center of that room, among all the tense faces, among all the angry, yearning eyes, Naomi Brooks stood, silent, steadfast, a lighthouse against a storm-tossed sea. The trial would be long. The battle was far from over. But today, for the first time in a very long time, the people of Savannah dared to believe that justice was no longer just a distant dream. Naomi stood tall on the witness stand, her hands lightly clasped in front of her like a soldier awaiting orders. She didn't need her uniform or the silver stars on her shoulders. Her posture alone was enough to draw the courtroom into breathless silence. Her back was straight, as if carrying not just her own story, but the unheard voices of countless souls who had been suffocated by injustice. The prosecutor gave a subtle nod. Naomi returned it, her quiet gaze sweeping across the courtroom, pausing briefly on the faces seated in the public gallery, faces of every color, every age, every walk of life, all looking at her with hope and expectation. She drew a deep breath, then began to speak, her voice at first as soft as fallen leaves, but soon sinking into every fiber of the room. I grew up in the south side of Savannah, where every black child learns a lesson before they even know how to tie their shoes. Don't draw attention. Don't argue with the police. Don't forget that your skin color might be the only reason you're taken away from your family. No one moved. An elderly woman clenched her trembling hand so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. A middle-aged man nodded slowly, his eyes rimmed with red. Naomi continued, her voice even, steady, like a slow drum guiding an invisible march. I remember the first time my mother told me, "If you see police while walking home from school, cross to the other side of the street." Not because I had done anything wrong, but because being in the wrong place at the wrong time could make me a target. She paused, giving the bitterness of those memories time to seep into every heart listening. But I also remember the first time I saw a soldier in uniform, walking proudly down the street. I thought, maybe, if I wore that uniform, the world would look at me differently. The room seemed to lean toward her, as if each gaze formed an invisible thread, anchoring Naomi to the witness stand amid a silent storm. I joined the military with that simple belief, that honor and courage would outshine color, that if I served faithfully and long enough, I would first be seen as a person before being judged by my skin. Her chin lifted, her voice gaining strength, every word striking like a hammer against the long-sealed doors of conscience. But that morning, on Savannah's sidewalk, everything I believed in was struck down. It didn't matter who I was. It didn't matter what I had done for this country. They only saw the color of my skin. A small ripple of murmurs stirred from the gallery but was quickly swallowed by the dense, reverent silence. Naomi pressed her lips together briefly, then continued, locking eyes with every juror. I could have fought back. I could have chosen the fists, chosen to scream, but I didn't. Not because I was weak, because I knew. If we wanted to change anything, it cannot begin with rage. It must begin with justice. A long pause followed, heavy and sacred like a prayer. Outside the courthouse, even the chants of the protesters seemed to hush, as if the entire city bent its ear to catch Naomi's every word. "I'm not standing here just for myself," Naomi said, her voice soft as silk yet unyielding as steel. "I'm standing here for every black child growing up in fear. I'm standing here to tell them you are not invisible." In the crowd, a teenage girl wearing a JROTC uniform clutched a small American flag tightly, tears streaming down her face. An old man wiped at his eyes, trying to hide his emotion. Naomi looked directly at the judge, at the prosecutors, at every juror. In that moment, she was no longer a victim, no longer merely a witness. She became a mirror held up to the conscience of an entire society. When you leave this courtroom, I hope you will not remember me only as a name, a story, or a viral image. I hope you will remember that justice must not be a privilege for some. If it is real, it must belong to all. She bowed her head slightly, a silent but resolute salute. The air inside the courtroom was so thick it seemed almost tangible. After Naomi's speech, every eye turned toward the defense table, where Daniels and Blake sat hunched like shadows adrift in a storm. The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a neatly pressed gray suit, rose. He paused briefly, adjusting his thin-rimmed glasses, trying to summon a tone of calm before he spoke. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice soft, almost coaxing, as if addressing frightened children. "We do not deny that what happened that morning was painful, but I urge you to place yourselves in my client's shoes." He swept his gaze across the room, where not a soul stirred. They were patrol officers in a city that has seen its share of unrest. They were trained to act swiftly in unpredictable situations. Mistakes, if any, did not stem from malice, but from the crushing weight of their duty to protect the community. A sharp hiss rose from the gallery but was quickly silenced. Naomi stood still on the witness stand, her gaze unblinking, her spine straight as an arrow. The defense attorney pressed on, his voice growing more plaintive, reaching for the jury's sense of compassion. "We do not ask you to ignore what happened. We only ask you to consider that, in those fleeting, heartbeat-driven moments, errors can occur without any evil intent." A long, heavy pause filled the room, each breath labored under the gravity of what had been said. Naomi met the attorney's gaze, not with anger, not with hatred, but with a calm fierceness that shook deeper than any shouted accusation. When allowed to respond, she stepped forward again, her voice rising, warm and resolute like a bell tolling through a foggy dawn. "I don't doubt that policing is a stressful job," she began, her tone unnervingly steady, "but Your Honor, pressure cannot excuse prejudice. Responsibility cannot be an alibi for systematic humiliation." She paused, letting her words settle over the room like an incoming tide. "My grandfather fought in World War II," Naomi continued, her voice dipping into an ancient sorrow. "He returned home carrying not only physical wounds but deep, invisible scars. And the first thing he encountered in his hometown restaurant was not a hero's welcome, but scorn, a refusal of service because his skin wasn't the right color." A wave of muted outrage rippled through the courtroom, but Naomi pressed on, weaving her words like cords binding every heart. "My father, growing up with those memories, still chose to become a police officer. He believed he could be better. He believed that by serving the people he could dismantle the walls of bias. But even wearing the same uniform, even after daily acts of dedication, my father could not escape the suspicion, the whispered slurs, all because his skin would not change." Silence stretched, heavy and solemn, reaching the very corners of the room. Naomi lifted her chin, and in her eyes was not the blaze of hatred, but the unbreakable flame of belief. "I love this country," she said, each word carving itself into the invisible monument of justice. "I love it enough to wear the uniform, to risk my life for the ideals we so often proclaim." A glint of light flashed in Naomi's eyes, a light no anger could extinguish. "But my love is not blind. I love America enough to demand that it live up to the promises that the flag represents." She placed her hand over her chest, over the glinting badge pinned to her uniform. My grandfather, my father, and I have fought for that flag." Naomi paused, her voice lowering into a powerful, resonant murmur. "Not to be treated as lesser on the soil we bled to defend." A sacred silence fell over the courtroom. Even the judge, a man who had presided over thousands of cases, could not mask the tremor in his hands as he lifted the gavel. No more words were needed, no more testimony, no more arguments. The gavel came down, its deep, solemn thud reverberating through the chamber like a final declaration. It was not just a verdict against Daniels and Blake. It was a wake-up call for a city, for a system, for a nation once proud to call itself the land of liberty, but far too long forgetful of its original promises. The echo of the judge's gavel, striking the dark wooden bench, carved itself into the minds of everyone in the courtroom like the final sound of truth. Daniels and Blake were found guilty on all charges. No more flowery defenses, No more evasive words, only the raw exposure of guilt and the rightful punishment for those who had trampled human dignity under the guise of justice. Daniels stared down at the floor, his face drained of all color. Blake dropped the crumpled tissue he had been wringing in his hands, his vacant eyes locking onto Naomi as if searching for an escape. But all doors had long since closed. There would be no redemption for those who betrayed the sacred oath pinned to their chests. In a voice thick with emotion, the judge sentenced Daniels to 12 years in prison and Blake to 9, with no chance of parole for the first 7 years. It was a heavy sentence in line with the expectations of millions watching from cities and towns across America, yet perhaps still not enough to erase the wounds they had inflicted. Daniels heard the gavel strike as if each blow was a nail driven into the coffin of his buried life. He sat frozen in his chair, the once proud shoulders now hunched in defeat, like a lost child caught in a violent storm. His eyes, once ablaze with confidence and defiance, had become two hollow voids emptied of all light long ago. His trembling hand clutched the cold edge of the wooden table, knuckles bleached white, grasping desperately at the last remnants of a power already stripped away. Blake kept his head bowed, beads of sweat trickling down from his temple and soaking the collar of his wrinkled shirt. His entire body seemed to collapse inward, every frantic heartbeat a lash against the pride he had built atop a foundation of blind arrogance. He felt himself plummeting into a bottomless abyss, with no one waiting below, and all the excuses he had once trusted now nothing more than rotting rafts drifting into nothingness. When the 9-year prison sentence was read aloud, a tiny part of Blake still clung to hope for a miracle, a reduction, a reprieve, a final chance for redemption. But all he received was the heavy silence of the courtroom and the cold, unyielding stares of those he had once looked down upon. At that moment, Blake understood. It wasn't Naomi who had destroyed him. It was his own arrogance, the years spent believing he stood above the law, that had led him to this inevitable downfall. Both Daniels and Blake now tasted the same primal fear. For the first time in their lives, they faced true justice. Not the kind they once twisted to serve themselves, but real justice, cold, impartial, and utterly unforgiving. As the second gavel strike reverberated, Naomi did not smile. She simply stood there, calm and steadfast, just as she had walked every dark mile of this long journey, because she knew true justice was never about the fate of two men. True justice would only begin when the entire system that allowed such injustices was forced into the light and made to answer. And that, at last, had begun. That very afternoon, the Savannah mayor's office held an emergency press conference. Before hundreds of flashing cameras and the simmering anger of the community, the mayor, his face taut and weary, announced, "The Savannah Police Department will undergo the most sweeping reform in the city's history. An independent oversight committee will be established. Every complaint of violence and racial discrimination over the past decade will be reviewed on a case-by-case basis." He paused, weighing his next words, but the truth could no longer be hidden. The police chief, having failed in his duty of leadership and oversight, has submitted his resignation, effective immediately. Applause broke out, not raucous, but deep and thunderous, like the roll of summer storm clouds. It wasn't joy. It was the heavy exhale of a community that had been holding its breath for too long. News of the verdict spread like a tropical storm sweeping across the American South. Neighboring states began calling emergency hearings. Mayors and police chiefs, once smug in their belief that our city has no problem, were forced to reckon with themselves. Old memos were unearthed. Forgotten complaints were dragged from dusty drawers. No one could pretend they didn't see any more. It wasn't just Savannah. New Orleans, Atlanta, Birmingham, cities once scarred by the shadows of Jim Crow, were now trembling as if an ancient map was being redrawn in the ink of justice. The media no longer reported just Naomi's trial. They dug deeper, unearthing stories of the voiceless crushed beneath the weight of corrupt power, stories of communities buried in the glamorous myths of American perfection. Across social media, the image of Naomi standing firm in court, hand over heart, her gaze unwavering, became a symbol for something much larger. Tags flooded in. Hashtag Justice is Duty, Beyond the Badge, and We Are Not Invisible. It was no longer just a single event. It was an upheaval. Naomi declined every interview request, every offer to become the face of a movement. She left only a handwritten note, posted online by friends. Justice is not a moment. Justice is a journey. And that journey only truly begins when we stop closing our eyes to the truth, no matter how painful it is. Marcus gripped Naomi's hand tightly as they left the courthouse. They didn't speak, but each footstep echoed against the old stone, a silent vow that change, however slow and scarred, was possible. On the courthouse steps, the crowd parted to form a quiet path. No one cheered, no one clapped. They simply stood, heads bowed, making way for the woman who had dared to confront an entire system. Naomi walked forward, head high, each step steady and deliberate, a living reminder to all. Justice is not something bestowed from marble towers. It must be earned, step by step, word by word, action by action, by ordinary people brave enough to demand it. And that day, under the gray sky of Savannah, an old city finally began to learn how to breathe again with the heartbeat of justice. 1 month after the trial closed, Savannah wore a different face. Gone were the angry crowds flooding the avenues. Gone were the barricades erected around government buildings. Yet, a slow, stubborn change had begun to seep through the city's streets, through the corners of its parks, through whispered conversations and small cafes lining the sidewalks. Naomi Brooks quietly returned to her ordinary life. She refused every interview, every invitation to speak, every offer to write a book or appear on television. For her, the spotlight was never the destination. What she sought was not the fleeting burst of applause, but the slow, steady change that takes root deep within the soil. And yet, this country, however belatedly, still knew how to recognize courage when it appeared in the most unexpected places. On a soft summer morning, in the humble setting of Savannah's Central Square, beneath the sweeping branches of moss-draped oaks, Naomi was awarded the Civil Courage Medal, one of the highest honors bestowed upon ordinary citizens who perform extraordinary acts for their communities. The ceremony was simple. No dazzling fireworks, no endless speeches, only faces, faces lit with belief and hope under the gentle June sun. Marcus stood silently in the crowd, his eyes fixed on Naomi like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. He watched her step onto the small stage, her figure small but unshakable, like a milestone planted deep into the earth. The event coordinator gestured, inviting Naomi to speak. The entire square held its breath. Cameras pointed toward her. Shutters clicked in the heavy, expectant air. Naomi took the microphone, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. The black and white faces, the elderly, the young, the veterans, the students in JROTC uniforms standing rigid like an honor guard. She held no papers, needed no prepared speech. What she would say had long been written in her heart. Her voice rose, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and patient, like water wearing down stone. I don't need your thanks. The square froze. I only need it tomorrow, Naomi continued, her voice dipping into the collective weariness and endurance where black children no longer have to lower their heads when they see a badge. No raucous applause erupted, only silence. The kind of silence that only truth, real and painful, can create. Then, from the crowd, a small girl, no more than 12, wearing a navy blue dress, stepped forward. She raised a handmade sign scrawled in marker. "I will hold my head high, Miss Naomi." A soft, wordless swell of emotion washed over the square, not through shouting or roaring applause, but through shimmering eyes, through heads nodding in fierce agreement, through hands clutching each other tightly in quiet solidarity. Naomi stepped down from the stage, disappearing back into the crowd like any ordinary woman, like a seed just planted in the dry, cracked earth she so loved. But her journey didn't end there. After the trial, after the speeches, after the sentences, the Savannah Police Department, once a symbol of cover-ups and unchecked power, was forced to transform from its very roots. New training sessions for recruits were entirely redesigned, and at the very first session, the very first class, they played a short clip. Naomi Brooks standing on the witness stand, straight-backed, unwavering, her voice ringing out like a bell in a long, dark night. No dogmatic lectures, no hollow slogans, just a simple, unforgettable, forgettable reminder. "We wear this badge," the instructor said, his voice thick with emotion, "not to demand respect. We wear it to be worthy of the trust of the most ordinary citizens." And then, as an unwritten oath, each new recruit was asked to stand, look directly at Naomi's image on the screen and pledge, "We will not betray honor. We will not let power become a weapon. We will never make a child bow their head because of the color of their skin." The seeds Naomi had planted that day, through quiet courage, through unwavering resolve, had begun to sprout. Through every small action, every silent decision, a new generation of uniformed officers would grow to understand. Honor is not granted. Honor must be built day by day, step by step, exactly as Naomi Brooks had shown them. And America, if it still remembers how to heal itself, will someday realize it owes its thanks to people like her, those who taught this nation with their own wounds that justice can no longer be delayed, not even for a single day more. Summer faded into fall, wrapping Savannah in soft winds, carrying the scent of damp earth and golden oak leaves. Life slowly returned to its steady rhythm, as if the storms of months past had been nothing more than a vivid, unsettling dream. Naomi Brooks did the same. She returned to her duties at the military base, early morning drills, neatly typed reports, routine patrols under the gentle morning sun. No cameras followed her now. No crowds chanted her name. She became once again an ordinary woman among ordinary people, doing small, steady work with the same unwavering devotion. And that was exactly how she wanted it. For Naomi, true strength had never been about applause or medals glittering under stage lights. Strength lived in quiet perseverance and continuing to walk forward even when no one was watching, even when the road ahead blurred into the mist. Yet, her mark did not fade with the old headlines. Her story, like carvings weathered into stone by wind and rain, had etched itself into a generation's memory. It lived not only in the new training modules at the Savannah Police Academy, not only in the reform programs broadcast on evening news, but in whispered conversations over coffee and the steadier strides of black children crossing streets under the gaze of patrol cars. In places so small they might have been overlooked, Naomi had planted change. One evening, after a late shift, Naomi passed through the city's Central Park. The sunset poured gold across the grass, staining the trunks of old oak trees with warm light. On a bench by the path, she saw a small group of students huddled around a young soldier, listening intently as he spoke about honor, about justice, and about a woman who had changed the way he understood the burden he bore. Naomi did not approach. She simply watched from a distance, her heart swelling with a quiet gratitude. She didn't need to be named. As long as the seeds she had sown continued to grow, it was enough. One crisp morning in October, Naomi received a letter, a rarity in the age of digital everything. The handwriting was neat but slightly clumsy, from a 6th grade girl, I never thought someone like me could make a whole city listen. You showed me I'm not invisible. You made me want to dream bigger, to do something good for the world." Naomi folded the letter carefully, pressed it against her palm, and closed her eyes for a long moment. In the wind stirring outside her window, she heard the faint echoes of dreams once crushed, now beginning to kindle anew. No miracles happened overnight. Prejudices, injustices, and scars from the past still lingered, embedded deep in the soil and stitched into old ways of thinking. But every step Naomi had taken, every word she had spoken, every time she chose steadfastness over anger, had become part of the first heartbeat in a long, slow song of change. And America, reluctant, halting, was slowly learning to listen. Years later, when Naomi had quietly receded from the grand stories, when her hair had turned silver at the temples, when classes of new officers graduated under a reformed code of honor, they still spoke of her, not as a fiery hero, not as a fleeting symbol, but as a small, unshakable stone resting beneath the river's current, shifting the flow, quietly but forever. In training classes, when new recruits were asked, "What is the most important thing about the badge you wear?" the answers no longer echoed old lessons about authority or discipline. They spoke of Naomi Brooks. They spoke of a woman who stood upright in the eye of injustice, who refused to let rage consume her, who never let hatred eclipse justice. And the new generation of officers, those who walk the night streets, those who extend helping hands instead of raising fists, carry that spirit with them in every quiet patrol. A true victory, not just for Naomi, not just for Savannah, but for a country still struggling to live up to the promises etched into cold marble walls. Naomi knew she might never see all her dreams fulfilled, but she also knew true victory was never about reaching the end. True victory was every day that someone, somewhere, chose to stand tall instead of bowing, chose resolve over silence, chose kindness over fear. And so Naomi smiled each night as she closed her front door, set her worn boots neatly by the threshold, and listened to the Savannah night winds whispering through the fences, the winds carrying a promise she had upheld her entire life. Justice is not given. It is claimed by those who dare to stand for what is right. The story of Naomi Brooks has come to a close, but the seeds she planted have quietly begun to sprout across Savannah and far beyond. She reminds us that justice is not granted through hollow promises. It is claimed through every steadfast step, every moment of standing tall against injustice, every choice to extend kindness over silence. Naomi never needed applause, never sought the spotlight. She only dreamed of a tomorrow where children of color no longer had to bow their heads before blind authority. And you, what about you? When faced with injustice, will you bow your head, or will you step forward as Naomi did? If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to help keep the flame of justice burning bright, not just today, but for the generations yet to come.